Good morning. I'm Bruce Hoffman. I'm a member of the Jamestown Foundation Board of Directors. I'm also a professor at Georgetown University and a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. It's my great pleasure to moderate this panel on violent far right and far left extremism. We have two of the countries, if not the world's, leading experts on both spectrums of that of those extremist ideologies. Professor Cynthia Miller-Idriss is in the School of Public Affairs and the School of Education at American University, where she also directs the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, which has the fantastic acronym of PERIL. Professor Miller-Idriss is also Director of Strategy and Partnerships at the UK-based Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, and serves on the International Advisory Board of the Center for Research and Extremism, CREX, in Oslo, Norway. She's the author of this excellent book, which I highly recommend, Hate in the Homeland, which I have read. In fact, I got an advanced copy on PDF, but I had to go out and buy it so I could underline it and write in the margins. It's highly recommended. She holds a PhD and MA in sociology and a master's in public policy from the University of Michigan, and a BA magna cum laude in sociology and German area studies from Cornell University. Also with us is Professor Michael Kenney, who is the Wesley W. Posvar Chair in International Security Studies and Director of the Matthew B. Ridgway Center at the University of Pittsburgh. Professor Kenney received his PhD in political science from the University of Florida and has held postdoctoral fellowships at Stanford University and the University of Southern California. He is the author of the excellent From Pablo to Osama, Trafficking in Terrorist Networks, Government Bureaucracies and Competitive Adaptation, as well as The Islamic State in Britain, which I also commend to you. My bookshelf in back of me, I was rushed and couldn't find From Pablo to Osama, but I have both of them. This book in particular was named received the Best Book Award from the Political Network section of the American Political Science Association in 2019. So thank you both very much for joining us. Professor Miller-Idriss, if you want to start, and then we'll move on to Professor Kenney.
Sure, and can you tell me again how many minutes I have so that we know the structure of the panel?
15 minutes or so.
Okay, great.
Up to that, but that would be ideal.
Terrific. So I'm going to raise several different things. Today, a lot of what I do, maybe I should explain a little bit of my background first, which is that I come at this from the perspective of far-right youth cultures and at the mainstreaming of youth cultures through clothing, through t-shirts, through things that are a little bit unexpected. And so most of my books have been in the category, my work and my research has been in the category of what I, for many years, thought of as subcultural fringe work. And I think a lot of what's happened over the last 3 to 4 years has brought some of that subculture and fringe work into kind of mainstream relevance in a different way. And so I think the kinds of questions that I can respond to here have to do with the changing nature of domestic terrorism, but also the ways that youth culture itself and online youth culture has been weaponized to change the kind of radicalization trajectory and the spaces and places where young people are first exposed to extremist ideas and ideologies in ways that open up new pathways. So what I'm going to talk about, I think, are things that maybe don't always traditionally fall under the rubric of domestic terrorism, but have the potential to open up trajectories that lead to domestic terrorism potential or violence and outcomes. So that's a sort of caveat to say that I think the importance of understanding how youth culture works and the changing structures and dynamics of youth culture is really essential in this area. So I want to focus my remarks on the online nature of it. And I'm going to talk about sort of 6 categories, or probably 5 categories of it very briefly, and keep an eye on the clock here. So the first is the changing nature of how online algorithms work, and the way that people become exposed through through search engines and through new ways of entering radicalization, new ways of being exposed through search engines, through algorithms, through recommendation systems, let's say, right in the mainstream, I guess. So instead of extremism being a destination online, it's something that people are more likely to kind of stumble into in ways that I think are new and unexpected. Example that I can give you, there are two examples. One is, of course, the well-known example of Dylan Roof, who explains both in FBI interviews and in his own manifesto that his radicalization trajectory began with a Google search, essentially, and that he considers that he was never the same since that day, since the day that he ran a search for black on white crime was the phrase that he searched for, and he was interested in trying to understand, because of a current event happening at that time, the George Zimmerman trial. He wanted to understand whether George Zimmerman was actually justified, is the way that he described it in his reaction. That search took him in a first hit to a white supremacist website, and then that kind of opened up the trajectory. But another more modern example, when I was giving a talk recently downtown in DC, I mean, not recently, pre-pandemic, when we could get together in person, someone approached me afterward and said that she had done, someone very established in the field, really knows what she's talking about when it comes to terrorism. And she said she had been doing a search for something related to Tupperware. And it was about ways to prep vegetables and store them in Tupperware. And it took her, the search that she did took her to an extreme prepping website as part of the search results, that she said she fully recognized what it was, but it was a very subtle kind of exposure to extreme prepping and apocalyptic kinds of scenarios that we know play a role in some of the accelerationist ideologies that have motivated terrorism. And the last example, so I talk about a lot of this in my book, the kinds of ways that people encounter these unexpected gateways through cooking shows, through mixed martial arts festivals, in ordinary places where they spend their lives. Suddenly, instead of extremist ideas being a destination, they are now a place where they can meet them in the mainstream. And so after I published the book, one of my friends told me that he was looking up videos on YouTube to learn how to install drywall for a DIY project during the pandemic, and started a series of 10 videos for drywall that by about video 3, he realized the guy who was just an ordinary person explaining how to install drywall was introducing white supremacist extremist ideas. But he felt stuck in the sequence of 10 videos, and he continued to watch those videos. And by the time the 10th video came around, it was very extreme content that was sort of mobilizing. And he recognized it for what it was, but it was a very subtle, deliberate introduction in a situation where somebody was stuck then in that sequence of video watching, unless he could give that up and find another sequence of videos that might help him finish the project. So it was a very strategic and savvy kind of use of that. And part of what I want to say is that those new places and spaces are not always, but partly driven by recommendation systems, personalized recommendation systems and algorithms that enable people to encounter things that they might not have otherwise encountered. So after that sequence gets watched, he could get recommended another series that already starts with more extreme content because other people have watched it, right? And so those, just like when you buy a t-shirt, you see other people have bought this similar kind of thing, those recommendation systems drive the content that gets seen in ways that one of the things we don't know enough about, in ways that influence the behavioral choices that people make. So it's not that they're just passive dupes being kind of drawn into a channel, but they are influenced in their kind of behavioral choices as well. So those are the kinds of, that's one of the big categories in the online ecosystem. A second category is the use of humor. And this can be very difficult for people who study terrorism to understand, because we think of terrorist and extremist ideologies as quite serious and as mobilizing people toward serious action, even if it's framed as kind of moral, heroic, right, and even emotional. But the extreme far right and the white supremacist extremist fringe, as well as the anti-government extremist fringe, has effectively weaponized the use of humor and irony and satire and wit in a way that has positioned far right extreme culture as the counterculture to the mainstream. And what's really important about this, I think, is that it's happening very heavily within youth culture in ways that are challenging to counter without falling into the trap of what, you know, teenagers say are just people being triggered snowflakes who can't take a joke, essentially, right? And so we see a lot of this in Holocaust memes, for example, Holocaust denial and Holocaust minimization. So again, I'm going to tell you another anecdote of a colleague who told me that he had overheard his son and a friend putting a pizza in the oven. I'm not going to repeat the entire meme, but an awful meme circulated about the Holocaust that compares the Holocaust to pizzas going in an oven. And when he asked why the boys had said this, the kid said, "Oh, everybody says it. It's a joke. You don't get it," right? And so there's this, you know, not just light jokes, but incredibly dehumanizing and extremely racist, scientific racism, extraordinary misogynistic memes, TikTok videos, you know, different kinds of new platforms and ways to communicate that content that easily go viral, that are communicated and spread as jokes, and that are shared that way, and then framed as the edgy counterculture in reaction to everybody else. And so this is one of the primary ways that young people in particular are drawn into the scene. The Boogaloo, I think, meme is an example of that, this anti-government extreme meme that stands for a kind of concept of civil war and or revolution or insurgency against a supposed tyrannical government. So I use this example just to show that this kind of thing comes up not only in the white supremacist fringe, but also in the anti-government fringe, where you have, I mean, there are patches that these guys wear that are actually refer to themselves as a meme-based insurgency. It's a joke that started among teenagers online who were used the phrase boogaloo to refer to the second of anything, and that got adopted as a way of talking about a second civil war. And then it became a meme. It became it morphed into other kinds of sound-alike words like big igloo and big luau, which then you know, changed into the wearing of Hawaiian shirts, also popular because luau's feature pig roasts, which is a slur used against the police. So in carrying this kind of anti-government, anti-law enforcement sentiment right there into the Hawaiian shirt wearing, which were also described as strategic tactics because if everybody shows up at these you know, kind of anti-shelter in place protests, let's say, wearing the same tactical gear as the National Guard might be wearing, it'll be hard to identify each other. So the Hawaiian shirts were also described as having tactical and strategic significance and allowing you know, people to recognize other allies within these crowds. So, you know, those are examples of how youth culture that seems like a joke. We saw Pepe the Frog, right, become very popular in far-right extremist scenes out of a joke, but then migrate into, through a very convoluted youth cultural meme adaptation way, into a flag of Kekistan that is the mythical land for the so-called alt-right, but then shows up in Charlottesville. It shows up in a protest in Brazil. We've seen it in Australia. So this online to offline action, I think, is really important, and thinking about the ways that even the kind of humor and the jokes that are deployed online can get used and to actually mobilize action. And I think that can be very difficult to capture and understand in the context of what we traditionally think of as extremist or terrorist mobilization, coming through ideological kinds of frames, because the ideology is there, but it's couched within this kind of humor, meme-driven, iconographic kind of aspect. So the last thing I'm going to say, and so I'm looking at the time and say, I'll just say 3 of the 5 or 6, but I can come back to the others in the Q&A. So I talked about algorithmic radicalization and recommender systems. I talked about the humor and meme-driven culture of this. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is that they're also, the online spaces are used as ways to build, not just to spread ideology, but ways to build communication channels, to create funding and financial mobilization, and to actually build a network across groups globally. And this is where I think it's really important, although we're talking about domestic terrorism, to really think of white supremacist extremism and terrorism as globally, as a global problem and as global flows. So there's the live streaming of attacks, first of all, and the sharing of manifestos. Importantly, that is, even when the attackers' native languages are not English, they're often live streaming or writing their manifestos in English at this point. That happened in 2 extremist terrorist attacks in Germany last year. So what you see is that there's a real global performance element to this. It becomes political theater in ways that is not only, it's not clearly a domestic audience or oriented for only the domestic national audience, but for a global one. They use the language of saints and disciples to refer to each other and to try to position each other as martyrs who will emulate one another. They crowdsource funding on funding platforms like Patreon or Researcher that have raised up to $200,000, let's say, for an identitarian initiative in 2017 from France that put a boat actually in the Mediterranean to try to block migrants from arriving in Europe. And that initiative in 2017 raised funds from over 3,000 individuals in small amounts of money from 8 European countries and from the US. So you see that those crowdsourcing initiatives, in a way that never could have happened prior to the internet, allow for mobilization and for people to feel committed to a cause and to take action and support financially even the actions of others. They share bomb-making materials, they share manifestos, they travel to train one another, they show up at mixed martial arts festivals in Europe, they're training camps where they come together. And all of that is, so there's in-person activities, I guess is what I'm saying, that are underpinned by this online ecosystem in really important ways. So all of this, I think, is to say in sum that, that when we talk about online radicalization, it's often talked about as a kind of, as if it's just a young person, a young man, a teenager sitting in a dark corner of their bedroom, like lit by, only the glow of the computer screen. And I think in each of the ways that the online ecosystem underpins the radicalization, the mobilization, the deepening of the ideology, we have to really think of it as an ecosystem that underpins the growth, that supports it. So it's building networks, it's driving young people to particular URLs that they might see on a flyer on their campus that says it's okay to be white, but then there's a URL that takes them to a different website. It's creating the funding platforms and the sources to do that. It's creating, I didn't get to talk much here, but I will in Q&A about the YouTube channels that stream actual talk shows that allow people to share their kind of white supremacist content or extremist ideas online. So there are, it's an underpinning of everything else that happens, but a connecting of the online world with the offline world that helps drive the mobilization and violence in important ways. So I'm going to stop there just because I could go on for a lot longer about those categories, but I think we'll come back to them in Q&A.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Cynthia. Before I turn the floor over to Michael, I was remiss in introducing him, but this past June, he and Colin Clark wrote one of the I think the best exegeses and analyses of the Antifa movement and of far left violent extremism, which is what he will address now. So, Michael.
Thank you, Bruce. And thank you to Glenn Howard and the Jamestown Foundation for the opportunity to discuss my work with you today. I'm glad you mentioned the War on the Rocks article, Bruce. I want to second the shout out to my co-author, the wonderful Colin Clark. It was a real pleasure to work with Colin on that piece. What we did in that article, well, the parts that I wrote, was drawing on research that I've been doing since 2017 on anti-fascism and anarchism more broadly. I did field work at different events, including the counter protest to the Unite the Right 2 rally in Washington, DC in the summer of 2018. I did a number of interviews with activists who identified as anti-fascists. So both in that article and what I speak about today is drawing on that field work. I want to talk about anti-fascism, what it is, how it's organized, what it does. But before I get to that, I want to put the violence in perspective. Yes, there have been recent incidents of far left activists who identify as anti-fascists engaging in political violence in the United States. A couple of recent examples would include Willem von Spronsen, a 68-year-old man who attacked an ICE facility in Tacoma, Washington with a rifle and incendiary devices in July of 2019. And then more recently, this past summer, another Antifa supporter by the name of Michael Forrest Reinell shot and killed a Patriot Prayer activist during a demonstration that was back in August. Now, these fortunately have remained isolated incidents, okay? So when you look at incident level data on whether you're looking at terrorist attacks or fatalities, and whether you're looking at the Global Terrorism Database or the CSIS data or data from the New America Foundation, folks that gather and put together and compile these data sets, what they show is that far-right extremists have engaged both in more attacks and in more lethal attacks in the United States than far-left extremists. And far-left extremists is a broader category that would go way beyond Antifa to include, eco-militants from the Animal Liberation Front, the Earth Liberation Front, Black nationalists, communists, socialists, and anarchists more broadly, okay? So if you're just looking at political violence associated with anti-fascist activists, you're looking at a very small number of incidents. Now, what I can talk about later and in the Q&A are the fights, the melees, the riots, which is where we tend to see more Antifa-related political violence. But first, so what is Antifa? How are they organized? So the first thing I would want to say is, as many of our viewers are certainly well aware, I'm sure, Antifa, which is short for anti-fascism, is not a single group or organization. Contrary to how they're portrayed in the media, it's not a single monolithic organization. Instead, it's a rather loose network of local, what they call affinity groups, who coordinate their anti-racist activism in different areas, along with a broader movement of individuals and groups who support anti-fascist ideals. These folks are dedicated first and foremost to stopping the sort of people that Cynthia was describing in her presentation, far-right extremists and racists, who they broadly label as fascists. They want to stop these people from organizing. They want to stop them from spreading their ideology. Antifa has no centralized leadership structure or formalized membership. In the United States, some anti-fascist groups do share ideas by participating in the Torch Network, which evolved out of the old Anti-Racist Action Network. They have organizing principles. One organizing principle that I want to just mention is we go where they go. This is an organizing principle of the old Anti-Racist Action Network. And it's interesting because it highlights the symbiotic nature of anti-fascism. Anti-fascism exists to counter what they call fascists, or white supremacists, far-right extremists. When levels of white supremacism and far-right extremism increase, you tend to see a rise in anti-fascist activism. And this is what we saw during the Trump administration. Anti-fascists typically organize their activism in small, tight-knit affinity groups with other activists that they know and trust. These folks may live in the same area, or they may be spread out broader across the country and come together when they meet up at protests. Decision-making tends to be based on group consensus and direct democracy, and this reflects their anarchist tradition, I should add. So different affinity groups from different areas do coordinate their activism. They communicate through social media and encrypted apps like Signal. How big is anti-fascism? You know, sometimes you see inflated estimates, okay? One thing about membership, people do not become card-carrying members of Antifa. There's no loyalty oath or pledge or formal induction process. People become Antifa supporters to the extent that they self-identify with the movement, support the cause, and critically become willing to engage in activism on its behalf. Some cities do have local groups, activist groups that identify as anti-fascists, such as Rose City Antifa in Portland, New York City Antifa in New York. There's dozens of examples. Some of these groups are active online and offline. They practice operational security, and they don't publicize their numbers or their members' identities. So that can make it difficult to estimate how big this phenomenon is. Mark Bray, a historian of anti-fascism, estimates that Antifa has about 5 to 15 members in most American cities where it operates. However, people that I've interviewed, including a veteran anti-fascist, argues that Bray's estimate is low, especially in large cities like Portland, where Antifa has been active for many years. If you count those cities, according to this respondent and other respondents I've interviewed, these numbers might be in the low hundreds per city, okay? But nationally, we're not talking about a movement that has millions of people, okay? Who knows how many we're talking about? It would be guesses, perhaps tens of thousands. I would be reluctant to put a number on it. We just don't know. But the idea that Antifa was running the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer, that's a gross overstatement. Yes, Antifa activists were participating in these larger protests, providing security, serving as street medics, but they were not directing the protests. What do they believe in? As I said, Antifa, short for anti-fascism. They seek to expose, confront, and stop far-right extremism, racists, and what they call fascists. They see this as an existential threat to America and must be stopped at all costs, okay? Beyond their commitment to anti-fascism, Antifa supporters do not follow a single ideology. However, both historically and during our current period, many Antifa activists are also anarchists. So anti-fascism has typically been an explicitly leftist position, okay? but it's not exclusively an anarchist phenomenon. In other words, you can have anti-fascists who are not anarchists, okay? But many anti-fascists do identify as anarchists as well. I can talk more about that during the Q&A if we want. So what do? Anti-fascists do not practice a single protest tactic, okay? Their repertoires of contention include things like education, spreading information about white supremacy in local areas. They do a lot of what they call doxing. That's where they seek to publicly expose, shame, and intimidate white supremacists by investigating them online and then posting what they find out on different websites. They also confront far-right activists at protests to disrupt their events. This may often begin, and I've seen this myself, with verbal challenges, shouting, and it can quickly escalate to physical violence, usually scuffles, fights, fist fights, hitting them with sticks. Property violence is something that you'll see. The idea here is to increase the cost of participation in far-right activism. Anti-fascists are also on the receiving end of this violence as well. At some demonstrations, anti-fascists will form black blocs, which is an old anarchist protest tactic where they dress up all in black, form a block and march together. It serves a couple of purposes: to show their unity and imposing presence, but also it's a form of operational security to make it harder for law enforcers and others to identify individuals. There's a history of anti-fascist activism that goes back over 100 years. I don't have time to talk about that. In the US, Rose City Antifa is the oldest existing American anti-fascist group that was formed back in 2007. However, anti-fascists have been active in the US going back decades more than that. They used to call themselves anti-racist action. Anti-fascism, it did increase during the Trump administration. As the white nationalist alt-right movement rose, so did anti-fascist activism. So there's always been kind of a symbiotic relationship between far-right extremism and anti-fascism, okay? Many Antifa supporters believe that Trump is a fascist demagogue who threatens the existence of America's pluralistic multiracial democracy. Right or wrong, that's how they see it. That's why they're so quick to label MAGA supporters as fascists, okay? They do see some forms of violence as legitimate, punching a Nazi, what they would call punching a Nazi in the face. They see that as legitimate. However, they do not necessarily see bombing civilians and other non-combatants as if it's an offensive act, as a legitimate form of violence. Okay, so is Antifa a terrorist organization? Well, first of all, it's not a single organization to begin with. Second of all, most political violence that is associated with anti-fascism falls under it could probably be better characterized as street fights, riots, melees that get out of control. Physical confrontation, property damage. Now, whether this rises to the level of what people like Bruce would consider terrorism is kind of an interesting question. I think that most Antifa-related violence that we see, including over the last summer, does not rise to that level. I'll go ahead and stop there because I've been speaking long enough.
That was great from both of you, immensely informative. Let me start with a question that's probably more for Cynthia, but Michael, I'd be curious on your thoughts as well, and then I want to come to you with a question. I think for many of us in this field, especially with the plot that was uncovered to kidnap Governor Whitmer in Michigan last October, there was an assumption that we would see an escalation of violence leading up to the election and then perhaps even on election day. It seems to be a dog that hasn't barked. Do you have any thoughts on that? And actually, I'll ask you that too, Michael, because of course, you know, when one thinks about it, you painted pictures of two very different movements in size, in intentions, sometimes in capabilities. But what fascinates me is they both embrace very much of an accelerationist strategy. In other words, to create chaos and disorder in hopes of bringing down the system. So that's why I don't think we could exclude the fact that why we haven't seen more radical left-wing violence as well. So Cynthia, and then Michael, if you could both answer that.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that those of us who watch the far right, right-wing extremists, I mean, we could talk about terminology here too. White supremacist extremists in anti-government space have been pleasantly surprised since the election that there hasn't been more spontaneous violence or mass planned violence. I do still think there are two particular points of concern. One is around the Electoral College and the other is around the inauguration. I do still think that there's potential and we should be on kind of high alert for it. But I also want to note that we have seen a real acceleration in violent rhetoric directed against elected officials. Websites going up, naming enemies, posting their addresses, their photos of their homes. People even who just work for Dominion, for the elected, like just work for an election machine, voting machine company, not even elected officials. Threats and people showing up at the homes of local health officials, banging on their doors, threatening them, death threats against them, nooses hung outside of people's homes. So there's a different level of, I think, the kind of political targeting, the kidnapping plot that was disrupted is part of a trend. We also saw last spring, the targeting of the judge in New Jersey, whose son ended up being killed. Last year, we had an assassination of a German politician who had been on one of those enemy watch lists. We had the assassination of Joe Cox, the murder of Joe Cox in the UK. So there have been several years where we have seen upticks in the kinds of threats against elected officials coming. And I think that has really escalated after the election, around the period of after the election, in the context of a kind of ideas about fraud or about the election not being valid. And I think there is a potential for that to turn worse in a different way than the kind of massive spontaneous planned violence at rallies or protests or the kind of things that we've been seeing with terror attacks in the past. So, I don't want to be alarmist, and I think it's a good thing that we haven't seen the violence that many people had predicted, but I don't think we're over or through to the other side of it yet.
Michael?
I would agree with Cynthia. I think it's too early to tell, honestly. I think the next 6 months to a year are going to be really important, as Cynthia said, to just be aware. Not to exaggerate the threat, but just to be aware of what's happening. With respect to the anti-fascists, one thing that I've learned in my research is that anti-fascists, they react to, again, what they call fascists, or what we would probably better describe as far-right extremists, white supremacists. They're anti-fascism is very much reactive. So what we're going to see from anti-fascists depends on what we see on the far right. For example, right now in Northern California, anti-fascists are mobilizing against Stop the Steal rallies in Sacramento and elsewhere, because in recent weeks, these Stop the Steal rallies have not only featured regular Trump supporters, but they've also featured Proud Boys, other white nationalists, and militia members. It's those latter groups that anti-fascists specifically mobilize to counter. So if we see an increase in mobilization by the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, other white nationalists, then I would expect to see a corresponding increase in mobilization by anti-fascists. This could occur after the inauguration. It occur after Trump leaves power. I don't know. But what I do feel reasonably confident in saying is anti-fascist activism is inherently reactive. So they will respond to what they see as a threat.
So in other words, I mean, is the election of Joe Biden then taken some of the wind out of the sails of the kinds of anti-establishment or protests against the system that, of course, crystallized at the last inauguration in Washington, D.C., and in fact, on election night, of course, resulted in downtown Washington being boarded up again?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the election of 2016 and Trump's inauguration in January, that galvanized anti-fascists, right? Because now what they had seen on the fringes was now, to Cynthia's point, was becoming more and more mainstream. Okay, now with the election of Biden, I do think it takes the wind out of the sails a little bit. However, I think it's important to add that anti-fascists do not view Joe Biden's election as a victory. They're not enforcers for the Democratic Party. They're not, okay? They're far left extremists. Most of them are anarchists, and so they follow ideals associated with that. I can speak more to that if we want, but yeah, so I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, can I follow up for a second? I mean, this is very interesting. You mentioned, of course, the Willem von Strassen attack in Tacoma, which was quite serious. But of course, 2017, there was the attack by at least a self-described leftist or Bernie Sanders supporter of the Congressional Republican baseball team. Do you think that there could be, because of some of the pushback that many Republicans, for instance, who don't want to accept the results of the election, not, the recent poll by the Washington Post of many Republican congressmen that would not comment. Could you foresee in the future a response or a pushback to what might be interpreted as efforts to nullify the electoral process in the United States by far left extremists and activists?
I think that if the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys continue to mobilize at Stop the Steal rallies and things along the line that you're mentioning, Bruce, then yes, absolutely. I would expect to see an increase in mobilization by anti-fascists, yes.
Okay, well, let me ask, we're starting to get other questions, but I do want to ask both of you a two-part question because, both of you talked about doxing in various forms. And of course, recently in the newspapers, senior Republican leaders in the state of Georgia, for instance, are being doxxed. So this is not just a tactic or technique of the left, as the far left, as Michael described. In both of your research, do you think that the law has kept pace with technology? And then the subsidiary question is, as has often been discussed over the past few years, would domestic terrorism legislation perhaps redress that if you don't think the law has kept pace with technology? And the weaponization via social media and other means, not just of radicalization and recruitment, but as you both described, of actual harassment of ordinary citizens doing their jobs.
I definitely don't think the law has kept pace. The question, I guess, is whether the law can keep pace, I think, and what does that look like? So, just on the issue of doxing alone, things like the fact that the DMV will regularly release information to private investigators who are saying they want to update their records, right? I mean, there are loopholes around, even for people who have really, really legitimate reasons to protect their data. It can be very, very difficult to do here compared to in Europe, where there's much stricter privacy privacy policies and laws in place. So I do think that the ease with which somebody can get personal information, can dox or post, wait till we get to the era of real, true deep fake videos. I think we're going to enter a whole, different era here on this. So I do not think the law has kept pace. I don't know, I think we need more experts who understand what the legal possibilities are. I have lots of concerns about the domestic terrorism statute that I think are probably different from the concerns that other people raise around civil rights violations. My main concern has to do with, because most of my work until the last few years has been in Europe, I worry about not just this country, but other countries continuing to frame the problem of white supremacist and anti-government extremism as domestic in nature. Instead of really finding ways to regularly and systematically unpack the global nature of it. And so I think that has real repercussions for example, in things like the UN's counterterrorism, Security Council's counterterrorism committee's ability to intervene in what they have since 9/11 basically seen as largely a domestic problem of member states, because that's how member states have defined it themselves. And one of the things that the UN has done in a hearing this fall, at least, is start to push the envelope on that by looking at things like the connection between white supremacist extremism and gender-based violence, for example, where there is a UN mandate. And so I think that, anyway, I just think that the framing of it has to be open enough to think about not just a divide between international and domestic terrorism, but really how can we think about these things as deeply intertwined. And I would say, just related to that, because I know there's a question about QAnon, I think another really important part of what's happening here is to not get caught in thinking of this only as an ideological divide on a spectrum between left and right, but as a rapidly evolving set of new coalitions. And one of the strangest developments of this year has been, and I think will continue to be over the next 6 to 12 to 18 months, the emergence of these coalitions that don't seem to make sense between anti-vaxxers and anti-government extremists, between yoga studio, yoga aficionados and QAnon supporters, right? Like there are unusual things happening that that mean the extreme fringes look a little bit different. And when you look at manifestos that use environmental justifications and climate change justifications for the terrorist attacks in Christchurch or in El Paso, for example, you see this kind of blending together of rationales that makes sense to a generation that sees climate change, in a different way. And so why shouldn't the right also then claim it as a part of their anti-immigration logic? If you see it through that lens, it doesn't make so much, it's not nonsensical, but it doesn't fit in the categories that we've traditionally used to define ideology as left or right. And so I think that QAnon is going to be one of the biggest challenges to this as we move forward. And I'm happy to talk about that separately, but I'll stop talking for now.
Right. What you describe is what the FBI has termed a salad bar ideology hopping or convergence ideology, right, which is becoming more prevalent and confounding to those who study terrorism and are charged with protecting us against these threats. Michael?
Right. I don't really have a lot to add to Cynthia's remarks. I mean, she spoke at length about that. I agree with much of what she said. I do see that question there about fundraising, and could I perhaps take a moment to address that, Bruce? Okay. I'm glad the viewer raised it. So in my experience, okay, based on the people that I was interacting with, interviewing, observing, anti-fascist activism was largely self-funded. It's not very expensive to do, and people, they often have jobs and they save a little bit of money, and so when they want to gather together in DC or Chicago or New York City or wherever, they basically use their own funds to go do that. And then another thing I saw in my field work was local efforts to organize and raise funds through local groups. So potluck luncheons, movie showings, public speaking events in which you're trying to raise a little bit of money. I am not aware of the Chinese Confucius Institutes on US campuses. I've never seen anything like that. But if there's a source that I haven't seen, I'm certainly open to taking a look. But what I've seen is that most anti-fascist organizing, okay, it's not funded by George Soros, guys. You know, it's not a thing, okay? It's self-funded.
Well, and indeed, as you've described, I mean, it's very grassroots and bottom up. It doesn't really need lots of resource. Everything you've described doesn't need lots of resources. It's not the intense planning and plotting that we see in more mainstream.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. Let's go to let's unpack further this question from Christopher Nickerson about QAnon. He asks, is there discussion among terrorism experts on how to address the white nationalist extremists and QAnon threat that is growing, which will affect national security, especially when the current administration and many US leaders provide direct or passive support to this danger? Cynthia?
So I can start the response to that. My research lab has a report on this coming out next week with the National Contagion Research Institute that has done both a qualitative and a quantitative analysis of what we're referring to as disinformation networks that are spreading kind of conspiracy theories in the QAnon space. So yes, I think there are, and we've been a part of a lot of conversations in advance of that report coming out about the national security implications of QAnon. And I would say not just national security, but several other dimensions. There are implications for election integrity, democratic kind of stability. There are implications for public health because of the ways that they're amplifying anti-vax conspiracy theories as well. And there are implications for kind of the potential to spread anti-Semitic, I mean, what really is at root a deeply anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that's centuries old, or traces of it. So the thing that's also maybe a little bit different about QAnon is that it's like a collection of conspiracy theories that at its core has a very deep and bizarre conspiracy theory, but not everybody who is sort of a follower of QAnon believes in the whole spectrum of the QAnon beliefs. So many of them just believe in the idea of a deep state and a kind of organized cabal of elites that are controlling, a sort of puppet master. But Soros, again, is deeply connected to that. There is a lot of anti-Semitic kind of framing about the funding and the Rothschilds, and then of course Bill Gates always comes up and is part of the conspiracy theory as well. So there are different dimensions to it, but yes, I would say those conversations are just starting to happen, and in ways that definitely need some expansion.
Michael, is there? I know there's not a QAnon in the violent or even the extremist far left space. But do conspiracy theories have the same currency or the same traction in what you've been studying as what Cynthia just described?
I don't know if conspiracy theories are as prominent a feature of the culture of anti-fascism as we see like QAnon, groups like that. I don't know. That's not to say that individual anti-fascists don't sometimes express ideas that might be considered conspiracy theories. But as far as the broader culture goes, I don't see the same level of focus on conspiracy theories within the anti-fascist movement as you see on the far right.
Great. We have another question from Christopher Nickerson. How are we addressing the enormous leverage and power of social media corporations and the creation of intentional algorithms that purposely direct people towards these extremes?
Well, I would say, I mean, there's a couple of different things. One, there have been some tweaks to the algorithms. Google has changed its autofill function, for example, really following Sophia Umoja Noble's fantastic work in her book called Algorithmic Oppression, are algorithms of oppression, which showed how bias is built in. So searches for the phrase Black girls, for example, would take as the top hits, take you to pornographic sites, and just, really, and they have since removed the kind of autofill feature that would automatically drive through algorithms, racial and gender bias, misogynistic bias. So there have been some changes like that. YouTube made tweaks to its algorithm in late 2019, although I haven't seen any findings on what kind of difference that made in the recommendation systems or in the likelihood of someone encountering extreme violence or violent content, extremist content. But I guess, there are lots of debates and discussions, hearings about the role of social media companies. We know that this is going, an ongoing problem. The challenge that I have is really that, like a lot of the stopgap solutions that come on the back end, once there's extreme content, how do we deal with the deplatforming, or how do we deal with the, from the social media side or from the law enforcement or surveillance or monitoring side? I think it's inevitably never going to be sufficient to capture the rapidly evolving. So, Boogaloo gets banned as a phrase, and they start using, not just Big Igloo and Big Lua, but other combinations of numbers. This is an age-old, strategy for, a couple of decades ago in Germany, when I was first studying schools there, they, one school banned the number 88 from display because 8 stands for the 8th letter of the alphabet, for HH for Heil Hitler. And kids started wearing t-shirts that said 100 minus 12 or 87 plus 1. I mean, there's just a constant kind of game playing that goes on, and that's amplified much more now in the social media and online ecosystem that we have. So algorithmic changes are important, and some monitoring of those is important, and there definitely needs to be more oversight. But I think that both the example of the Tupperware, the example of the DIY drywall might be a kind of thing that could be caught and removed. But at the Tupperware algorithm, it's very hard for me to see how tweaks to an algorithm could fix that problem. You can see how tweaks to an algorithm could fix the problem of white supremacist content being the first hit for somebody like Dylan Roof. But for something like Tupperware prepping searches leading to an extreme prepper website, I find that a much more difficult thing to imagine. But this is why we need the imaginations of people who actually work in the social media space or who are experts on that to actually help us dream it up. So we do need more oversight and interventions, but I think it's a challenging problem that we just begin to kind of try to unpack.
Michael, is this, social media and algorithm issue, is this more specific to violent far-right extremism or far-right extremism than it is to far left?
Well, I don't know if I'd want to say that. I mean, the far left folks, there's a strong anti-fascist presence on Twitter. There's many folks that are active on Twitter but, they're not engaged in illegal activity. It's basically spreading political views. So that would be the challenge there. And then to Cynthia's point, if you tweaked the algorithm to somehow address the Tupperware issue, they would adapt anyways, and that goes back, I think that's something that's long been of interest to me. And from Pablo to Osama, I spent a lot of time talking about the adaptability, whether we're talking about transnational organized crime or terrorism. These folks are inherently adaptable. Anytime the state does something to counter them, they will try to adapt to that and continue their activities. So we can tweak the algorithm, but we have to recognize that it's going to be a constant game of cat and mouse, or what one might call competitive adaptation.
I would just, if I could add really quickly to that, I think, for the argument that I make and that my research lab sort of focuses on is, as a result of that kind of the feeling that it's not entirely futile to try to work on the back end of policing the social media sites or improving surveillance and monitoring and algorithmic changes, and maybe not totally futile, but just never going to solve the problem. that where we can put a lot more time and energies into the intervention and prevention space in helping people better recognize what does it look like when they encounter that, so that more people react the way that my colleague reacted when she saw the Tupperware site, the search take her to the Extreme Prepper site. And when my friend saw, recognized what was happening in that drywall installation series of videos with the subtle increase of content into real white supremacist extremist ideology by the end. Where we have real vulnerabilities is when people don't recognize those misinformation and manipulative techniques for what they are and understand the kind of propaganda. What is it like to encounter that propaganda? And one of the things I often say is we've done, I think, a remarkable job as a society at better educating young people in this generation than they were a generation ago on how to protect their digital footprints and their privacy online, how to recognize kind of techniques of predators online. But we haven't really done much to prepare people for how to recognize propaganda or scapegoating or techniques of manipulation. What does it mean when you encounter white supremacist content? And that's a pretty shocking thing to acknowledge when you realize that statistics like out of the ADL reports showing that 23% of online gamers encounter white supremacist content or conversations about it while gaming, right? So it's you have to realize that if a large number of people are going to encounter this kind of content, we have to do a better job of equipping them to recognize it for what it is and understand how to reject it. Otherwise, we just end up with this constant, I think, as Michael's saying, cat and mouse game as more and more of them become drawn into it in these mainstream spaces that then can quickly radicalize them into the fringes.
Well, we've just crept
Agree
back.
more with that. I think Cynthia is spot on. We need more of a focus on prevention, intervention. We've learned a lot over the last 10, 15 years on CVE, dealing with one certain type of perpetrator. We need more work on prevention and intervention in this country when it comes to white supremacism.
Well, thank you. Well, we've just crept past the noon hour, so it's time to wrap up. I want to thank you both for these really informative and tremendously insightful presentations, and indeed for the research that both of you are doing and your ability to communicate it so effectively. Perhaps to put this all in perspective, I suppose I'm one of those analysts that then DCI or Robert Gates described as that when they smell flowers, they immediately think funeral and not wedding. But I think it's important to put all of this in context. This summer, President Trump said that this is worse than it's ever been, describing more of what Michael was talking about. But as we've heard from Cynthia, certainly, and as Michael also noted, that the activities on the far right have been much more extensive and pervasive. But I often think that, 50 years ago in the United States, there was basically more than one terrorist attack per day. There were over 500 terrorists, and we're talking about not the street brawling or online harassment, some of the things that we've been talking about, but guns and bombs. And then interestingly too, it was predominantly left-wing. There was of course far-right extremism, but it was marginal. So it's important to keep that in perspective. Terrorism is not unknown to the United States in our history. As I said, about 50 years ago, at the height of another very polarizing era because of extended overseas military commitments, for example. Anti-immigration sentiment was also rising. But for various reasons, there was a lot of what we actually do call terrorism. But that doesn't diminish, I think, the very cautionary and warning notes that both of you have sounded about trends and phenomena that have been gaining momentum, certainly over the past few years. So let me thank you all for tuning in and turn it over to the president of the Jamestown Foundation, Glenn Howard.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I really appreciate everyone and your presentations today. And thank you for all those who've watched us in the past week for our 14th annual Terrorism Conference. We're delighted that everyone once again supported Jamestown by watching these events. I wanted to note that we will have this event posted online on our Jamestown YouTube channel. So all the events from the past week will be posted there. So I encourage you to follow up and watch those when you get a chance. And thank you to everyone, Bruce for moderating, Cynthia and Michael, thank you for participating today, and I wish everyone a happy holidays and a Merry Christmas. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Bye, everyone.